on MLK Day. The co-chairs will be sharing with us, as well as national faith leaders. I'm going to ask Rabbi Rick Jacobs to start just with his name and title, and then we'll move around, ask Reverend Casimir Brown and Dr. Adam Barnes to lead us and just getting everybody introduced, and then Bishop Barber and Dr. Liz. Rabbi Jacobs.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rabbi Rick Jacobs. I lead the Union for Reform Judaism, the largest and most diverse Jewish movement here in North America.
Thank you. Next, we will have Reverend Dr. Terry Hord Owens.
Hello, I'm Reverend Terry Hord Owens, the General Minister and President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the U.S. and Canada.
Thank you. Next, we will have Dr. Winsler Nosley.
You're on mute, Dr. Nosey. Yes.
Okay, good morning. My name is Winsler Nosey, spiritual leader with the Apache Stronghold in Arizona, the San Carlos Apache tribe. Good morning.
Good morning. Next, we will have Reverend Dr. J. Herbert Nelson.
Reverend Dr. J. Herbert Nelson, State Clerk of the Presbyterian Church, USA.
Thank you. Next, we will have Reverend Dr. Susan Fredrick Gray.
Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. Susan Fredrick Gray. I'm the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, representing congregations across the United States and abroad.
Thank you. Next, we will have Reverend Dr. John Dohar.
Hello, John Dorhauer, General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ, one of 64 united and uniting communions around the world.
Thank you. Next, we will have Imam Omar Suleiman.
You're on mute, Imam Suleiman. You're on mute.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Imam Omar Suleiman, the founder and president of the Akeen Institute for Islamic Research, also the resident scholar at the Valley Ranch Islamic Center, member of Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square.
Thank you. Next, we will have Joyce Ajaluni.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, Joyce Ajaluni, General Secretary for the American Friends Service Committee, Quaker organization, century-old, working globally here in the US and around the world.
Thank you. Next, we will have Reverend Kelly Hudlow.
Yes, I'm Kelly Hudlow, a priest in the Episcopal Church and a member of the Alabama State Committee of the Poor People's Campaign.
Thank you. Next, we will have Reverend Claudia de la Cruz. I think you're muted.
Yes. You're unmuted now, Reverend Cruz.
Unfortunately, we can't hear you. Can you try?
Okay.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Great, sorry about that. My name is Reverend Claudia de la Cruz. I'm Executive Director of the People's Forum in New York City and a member of the National Steering Committee for the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival.
Thank you. Next, we will have Reverend Rodney Williams.
My name is Reverend Dr. Rodney Williams, pastor of the Swope Parkway United Christian Church in Kansas City, Missouri, president of the Kansas City, Missouri branch of the NAACP, and a member of the Poor People's Campaign National Steering Committee.
Thank you all for being here today.
Bishop Barber and Dr. Liz.
Good morning. Good morning. This is Bishop William J. Barber II, president of Repairers of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, along with my dear sister, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris. I'm, you see my picture up, I'm not on live, but I am with you verbally. I wanna thank some of the most powerful, loving, and thoughtful religious and moral leaders in the nation and in the world who deeply care about this world and people for joining us this morning to really make some comments about how we move forward, how we address our pain. And we have said, we are saying together that there must be love connected to justice, there must be light deeply rooted in truth, and we must have leadership with a moral agenda. This moment in our nation is not about left versus right or centrist, and it should not be about Republicans versus Democrats and independents. The question is really not can parties be, but can America be? Can she be what she's promised to be? And can she be, as Langston Hughes once said, what she ought to be, but has not ever fully been yet? We are very clear, and our deepest religious and moral documents tell us that there is no way, over and over again, the scriptures tell us, for ultimate healing in a nation without breaking the chains of injustice and get rid of exploitation. Jesus told us that a nation that's going to truly be healed and great must start at the bottom, the least of these, and would be judged by how that nation treats the poor, treats the hungry, the sick, the stranger, and those on the margins of life. But even our Constitution tells us, we often talk about healing a nation. And sometimes people don't understand that to heal a nation, you must first address the sickness in the body. That true healing and unity is not merely just us lowering the tone or getting along. It is about us changing direction, which is why our Constitution starts within the preamble, the establishment of justice. And then second is ensuring domestic tranquility. In other words, our Constitution says we must establish justice, and then we can ensure domestic tranquility. And then we can hold on to domestic tranquility by providing for the general, the common defense, promoting the general welfare and equal protection under the law. But there is no healing, there is no real domestic tranquility without establishing justice. You know, even what we saw happen at the Capitol 2 weeks ago, yes, was fomented by the current president and many other people in corporate suites and in political offices. But we need to hear in America, it was the result of a long history, a politics of division that was cynically named in the 1960s positive polarization. It's a history that caused Dr. King the night before he was died to say the nation was sick, while he still said, I have hope that we will make it to the promised land. This positive polarization was designed years ago by those who thought they could use it for their own political advantage. And members, many of Richard Nixon and Kevin Phillips, Pat Buchanan, decided to come up with a strategy of division. They literally said, we will divide the country, and we believe if we do it, we will get the bigger half. And the strategy was feeding and seeding intentional racial and class division into the body politics. And what we saw last week is what oppressed people have seen down through the years. If you do that long enough, it will spill over into the inevitable violence that ideas of white supremacy and lies always produce. And on this day, MLK Day, make no mistake, the same forces of reactionary rage, fueled by lies and ideas of white supremacy that killed Dr. King, erected gallows on the National Mall and ransacked the Capitol on January 6th. And if we want to come out of this jam and move forward, we cannot accept racial disparities, violence, and breaches that impact Black, Brown, Native, and Asian Americans, while also offering collateral damage to our poor white brothers and sisters, and ultimately our entire democracy. That's why when the Poor People's Campaign met with the Biden policy team, we brought in that meeting union members, white farmers, poor coal miners from Appalachia, Black people from Alabama, brown people from California, fast food workers from the Carolinas, economists, public health specialists, and civil rights lawyers, and moral religious leaders. And we said to them something that Dr. King said. As I close these comments, we will hear a lot of talk about I have a dream, but some people don't remember that that speech wasn't named I Have a Dream. The actual title of the speech was Normalcy Never Again. And on that day, they were actually calling for a comprehensive Civil Rights Act, not just kumbaya and people holding hands. And on that day, they were calling for a $2 minimum wage, which today would be $15 an hour. What if we had followed that agenda? What if the nation had fully embraced it? We know that after they called for those two things, less than 17 days later, 4 little girls were blown up in a church. But it was their deaths that caused many people to say, we've got to go in a new direction. This gasoline that we saw ignited the other week has been poured out for a long time. Trump is just the latest one, and others who have come along and lit the match. We finally must remember what Dr. King said the last night he was with us. We often say that was the mountaintop speech. But before he talked about going to the mountaintop and previewed the possibility of his own death, he said the nation was sick. And then he said, nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop at this point. He said, we must give ourselves to this movement because we are brothers and sisters. And we either go down together or we go up together. We must give ourselves to this movement. And so the way out, we believe in this moment, is to heal the mourning and the hurt that people are experiencing. And we've said to this current administration, healing will be enacting comprehensive, full, just COVID relief, lifting from the bottom, guaranteeing quality health care, regardless of existing conditions, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour immediately, updating the poverty measure to a true measurement, and looks at what it costs America to continue inequality. We need access to all of these vaccines, regardless of income, age, ability, disability, documentation status. We need a national rent freeze and mortgage moratorium. We need a national moratorium on utilities and shutoffs. We need to increase the impact of food and economic security by expanding programs like SNAP and WIC and child tax credits and earned income tax credits. We have to have resources to keep all rural hospitals and community health centers open. We have to have an infusion of resources to Indian health services. We must increase support for public schools. We must enact federal infrastructure jobs that prioritizes socially and climate beneficial jobs in poor and low wealth communities. We must protect and expand voting rights and civil rights. We must have comprehensive just immigration reform and demilitarize and stop the caging at our borders. We must enact fair taxes and repeal the gross tax cuts. And we must use the power of executive orders to undo the executive order damage, and we must redirect some of the bloated Pentagon budget toward priorities to get us out of COVID, to get us out of this moment. We must push a moral agenda. We must stop the takeover of native lands like what's happening at Oak Flats in Arizona. In other words, we must choose policy nonviolence and stop policy violence. And nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back at this point. Thank you so much, and we'll take questions after others have spoken. Liz?
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Barber. My name is Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. I'm the director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary and co-chair with Reverend Dr. Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. On the anniversary of the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., who, had he not been assassinated, would have been 92 years old this January 15th. It's only fitting to share these still timely and prophetic words of his. Power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. On the anniversary of his birth, the nation must have the moral courage to carry on the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and so many others. It must say no to the violence and racism that are so emboldened at this time. It must enact a bold policy agenda that lifts from the bottom so that all may rise. This week, President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris will be sworn into office and inherit a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a racial reckoning that demands bold action. President-elect Biden has already said that on day one, he will commit his administration to confronting the pandemic, the recession, systemic racism, and climate change. And we remember 4 months ago, during an event with the Poor People's Campaign, that he told an audience of more than 1 million people that together we can carry on Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, which is based on a simple moral truth, that we're all created in the image of God, and everyone is entitled to be treated with respect and dignity. He concluded promising that ending poverty will not just be an aspiration. It will be a theory of change to build a new economy that includes everyone. This is the healing that the nation needs. This is the way we can build back better. We hold up these 14 policy priorities that Dr. Barber just read that come from the pain and the suffering, but also the hope, love, and justice of 140 million Americans who are poor and low wealth, who are organizing and mobilizing, educating and engaging a moral fusion movement from the bottom up. These policy priorities address racism, poverty, low wages, the lack of healthcare, immigrant rights, indigenous rights, the destruction of the earth, the violence of a war economy and militarism, and they must be enacted in the first 100 days. We call on our elected leaders. We call on our entire society to do what the signs held at Dr. King's memorial read. Honor King, end racism, end poverty, end injustice. We call on all to move with us forward together, not one step back. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Liz. We have printed statements for the press from the participants on this call. Could ask just a few of you to share your statements or a portion of your statements from Terry Hoard Owens, Dr. John Dorhauer, Reverend Dr. J. Herbert Nelson, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, and Dr. Nosey. If you would just share a portion of your statements. Reverend Terry.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. On January 6th, the U.S. Capitol was violently, intentionally assaulted by a mob bent on destruction of not only the processes, but the places and even the people who lead our democracy. For generations, marginalized people, including Black and Brown people, Indigenous people, women, immigrants, and the poor have stood on the promises of the Constitution in order to call the nation to account, to ensure that there's liberty and justice and tranquility and prosperity for all, to call America to make good her vision. And in seeking to claim the promises of democracy, the marginalized have either been attacked, killed, or ignored. On January 6th, those who sought to destroy the promise were welcomed and met with very little resistance. And even as we lament, grieve, and pray, we must ensure that such evil is not allowed to stand. Today, we honor Dr. King, this Christian theologian who grounded his nonviolence philosophy in the practice of love, light, and leadership in the service of justice. And as a nation, we must reclaim our moral standing and hear the words and heed the words of Dr. King, who reminded us that physical force cannot create or organize anything that will stand. Only love and the way of nonviolence can restore America's promise. And so in the spirit of that love, I urge the Congress and President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris to support this 14-point policy platform of the Poor People's Campaign by ensuring that all of our citizens have enough wages, healthcare, housing, safe environment. We can ensure that America's moral leadership with love and light can fulfill her promises to all her citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Owens. Dr. John Dohauer.
Thank you. The United Church of Christ is outraged, not only by the attack on our nation's capital, but by the permission given by our current president for white supremacists to crawl out of their rat holes and rise up to spew their hatred. And we will continue to resist the vile rhetoric and violent attacks perpetrated by these racist insurrectionists. We denounce the words and actions of a president that fueled the insurrection. We call for his impeachment and pray that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will help us to all heal from the atrocities and tragedies experienced over the last 4 years. Well, we remember the words of Dr. King, who said that hate cannot dispel hate. Only love can do that. And so we invite all Americans to seek the better angels within us all and to counter the hatred we have seen and experienced with the love that conquers fear. And so in love, we will feed the hungry. This will be our response to the violence. We will shelter the homeless, educate our children, welcome the immigrant and the refugee, and ensure that no person is treated differently because of their race, gender identity, religion, or economic status. We join all on this call in prayers for a peaceful transition of power and hope that with this new administration comes also a desire to heal the divisions that are tearing families and communities apart. May it please God to bring peace to our land and an end to the racist violence and rhetoric and usher in the day of the beloved community. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. J. Herbert Nelson, Presbyterian Church, USA. You're on mute, Dr. Nelson. You're on mute, Dr. Nelson. Okay, all right.
Giving thanks and honor to God for this day, we're reminded in these moments that we are looking at a change with regards to the issues of this administration and beginning to look at a new possibility. However, we must be very clear that what is before us is the ongoing residue of the administration that is currently leaving. We have been stripped of many things, including school children who are struggling to get their education, and yet at the same time find themselves in the midst of a pandemic that went out of control and in which we did not pay the attention necessary in order to help not only the children, but their parents who struggled with no jobs and no opportunities to be able to earn income, and stimulus checks that came too late. Right now, we are finding a nation that is struggling on so many different levels. And it is important that we who work for the one who gives us life, health, and strength and offers us grace every day ought to be willing to begin to focus our attention on these particular issues. We are having people who are dying on the vine and who are still struggling to come up from the dredges of brokenness, pain, hurt, and more than anything, an inability to support themselves. It will be important for the Biden-Harris administration in many ways to be able to recognize early on in this battle that this is a struggle for our nation. But even beyond that, for all of us in our communities and throughout this nation to recognize that we must find our way back to defining neighbor as we do in a faith commitment
and particularly out of the heritage that I come from, the Judeo-Christian heritage. And that is that when we begin to talk about the issues of faith, we're talking about the whole company of believers, but we are also talking about those who do not believe and have yet to find themselves a way by which to find an entry into the positive places within their lives and within the possibility of faith. We're calling, in a sense, not just upon the government to do it, but the church must labor with the government. And in this particular administration, it is my prayer that the doors will be open, that we might be able to walk with this administration through these difficult times. Again, there is much to be repaired. There are many struggles to overcome, and there's still people who are suffering right now and need the care of people of faith.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Just a few more, and then we'll be ready for questions. Rabbi Rick Jacobs, Dr. Nosey, and Reverend Claudia de la Cruz, if you would speak in that order. Rabbi Jacobs.
Thank you. On this day, when we honor the teachings of one of our greatest leaders, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we are inspired by the ancient narrative of liberation that he loved from the book of Exodus. Dr. King spoke truth to the pharaohs of his day. We must do no less. On January 6, incited by President Trump and egged on by his enablers in Congress, thousands of his supporters stormed the Capitol building in an act of domestic terrorism. White nationalists, some of whom were carrying Confederate flags or wearing anti-Semitic t-shirts, came not to protest, but to overthrow a government that they had been told repeatedly and falsely is illegitimate. In response, we've heard calls for unity and healing, but the prophet Zechariah taught us to love truth and peace. If we only love peace, we will be content with the veneer of unity. And if we only love truth, our world could not endure. So we are commanded to marry love and truth. 7 verses into the book of Exodus, we learn that for better and for worse, a new leader can change everything. Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim, a new king arose over Egypt. In 48 hours, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be sworn in to lead America forward. The work before them and us is daunting and morally urgent. The twin plagues of coronavirus and racial injustice have shined a spotlight on the deadly impact of systemic racism in our country. 140 million poor and low wealth Americans desperately need comprehensive and just COVID-19 relief. We need the new administration to protect and expand the voting rights and civil rights of all Americans. We need to end unjust policing practices that disproportionately target Black men. We need to ensure just wages and compassionate immigration policies. But the new administration cannot do this work without each of us. Like Dr. King, like Moses, we must say, Hineni, here I am, and do the hard work of building support in every community for policies that recognize and protect the divine spark in every person. In the coming 4 years, may the loudest religious voices in our land be the ones that call each of us to be instruments of God's love and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Jacobs. I understand, Reverend Claudia, you need to leave a little early. So if you would speak, just say a brief word, and then Dr. Winsler Nosey.
Thank you. It is important to remember that 50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. said, we have occupied or come to this space, this hallowed spot, to remind the United States of America of the fierce urgency of now. We have no time to lose. Our livelihoods depend on it. Our generations depend on it. On January 20th, the Biden administration will take the presidency of the US. This post-Trump period does not mean that Trumpism has left. We will have a period of characterized by a profound social and political polarization, multiple crises, and continuous attacks on the poor and dispossessed. And what we are demanding, this moral and economic agenda of the people, is not only of moral necessity, it is of outright imperative need for the guaranteed livelihood of communities across this nation. It's been far too long, and it is pending business that we've had for hundreds of years. And it is not lack of resources, but lack of political will and lack of prioritizing our lives over profit. It is time for us to continue to move forward this people's agenda, this moral agenda, with a profound understanding that our people are destined and determined to win.
Thank you, Dr. Claudia. And we'll conclude our speakers with Dr. Wensler Nosey from the Apache Stronghold. Dr. Wensler.
Yeah, the Jane, she pego ste kunin yako de chon he na linakle. Thank you. What that means is that this morning I descended down from our holy mountain to be with you all today and speak, as well as it's a reminder that we speak of what is bad in this world, that nalini nakle means that it'll be a poof and disappear. And the people, our people, we talk of a time of a beginning, the beginning of our leaders, the beginning of our holy people, when the newcomers came to the land and a ball rolled to one of the child, and go to Yashem, Geronimo mentioned to the people, said, if you touch it, you'll forever change, because what it carries is the disrembling of the earth, in that you'll no longer have ties to the mother. And so it's very important that we understand the very beginning, because the beginning will really dictate the future. And that's why I said it's always important to know the first chapter. It's like you cannot understand a book if you read second, third, fourth chapter. You have to read the first chapter and how all this evil came and what it is today. Our people have already prophesied a day that we have witnessed in DC, that the ugliness of this country will finally surface to the above. But now, will the people really start the road of healing? Will the people really commit themselves to what is holy and what is sacred? And today in Arizona, over 160 years for us, it started 160 years ago when the people came here finding gold, copper, silver, and they began to torture the people through federal policies. And now, 160 years later, we're facing that today. This year, once the federal court assigns the hearing, that religious belief will be on the floor of this United States of justice to determine if our religion is really a religion. And so to me, as far as being suppressed, the injustice is still occurring. And so again, what are we going to all do? Because we believe that everybody has a right. As the way we're told is that it's like trails that go to the top of a mountain. They all lead to the same place. It is not one for the other to step on the other. It's sad that America's English words have defined our religion as though it's not religion. We are religious people. And so I stand with all of you in this healing. And as I said many times, as long as we're on the road of healing of this country, then it's important that we all stay together and be on the narrative that should be said and consistently hitting Congress, the presidencies, because these are politicians. And I've been among them for over 36 years, and they've changed and changed and changed their positions. So it's important that repetition of where we stand is really important to continue. Ahia, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wensler. Thank you. Just before we take questions, Bishop Barber, if we could maybe have Imam Suleiman just say a brief word before we take questions.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to begin by pushing back on the assertion that what we saw is not America. we can't fix our problems unless we're honest about them. What we saw has been America to many Americans for a very long time. In front of our mosques in Dallas, we've had regular armed white supremacists point their rifles at us for 5 years now. And guess what signs they were carrying before they wore the MAGA hats? Ted Cruz signs. And it was after he suggested that Muslim neighborhoods needed to be patrolled, along with now Congresswoman Beth Van Dyne, who was the mayor of Irving at the time, suggesting we were operating secret Sharia courts in Texas. The names on the signs have changed a few times, but the ideology of white supremacy that underlies them has been the same. I've watched commentators, many who would consider themselves liberal allies, make remarks about how this looks like Syria or Iraq. And no, it looks like America. That doesn't mean it's what America has to be. When we came together in rejection of the Muslim ban at the start of this horrendous presidency, we chanted in the airports together, "Tell me what America looks like. This is what America looks like." That didn't mean we thought that America actually looked like what we saw at the airport in our unity. It meant that's what we wanted America to look like. It was a statement of aspiration. And so I want to be clear that as America faces the three-headed monster today of poverty, racism, and militarism in full force, in regards to poverty, the poor have only gotten poorer and been told that their lives matter less by policies and bailouts that prioritize the rich over them. In regards to racism, the police continue to shoot unarmed Black men dead, and immigrant children continue to live in fear of cages and ICE thugs, while Muslim prisoners are force-fed pork in ICE cells and white supremacists get organic food. In regards to militarism, America has engineered destabilization abroad through Republican and Democratic administrations and dropped bombs and drones on innocent people with no sense of accountability. We need to make sure this stops once and for all. As people of faith, we reject the false ideal of white privilege and the myth of American exceptionalism. Humanity matters, and America must play a role to ensure the human dignity of those within its borders and not violate the human dignity of those across the world any longer. I pray we can not only come together to demonstrate what true unity looks like, but start to assert the dignity of those who have been left out of the dream and subjected to the American nightmare for far too long. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar Suleiman, Bishop Barber, and Dr. Liz.
Yes, thank you all, my powerful brothers and sisters, for your wisdom, your deep spirituality. Just before questions, we want to also remind people, as my dear brother said, we've been saying that what we have seen according to our founding documents and our deepest moral traditions is un-American, but what we've seen is not non-American. Too much of it in our history. Too much of it in our present. And we have to face these issues. You know, we read a lot about Dr. King, but Dr. King also said in 1965, standing on the steps of the Alabama State House, when he was told that he might be shot that day, 1965, after Selma to Montgomery. And he looked at the division and the hatred that was against the Voting Rights Act. And he stepped back into the 1800s and said this. He said that the aristocracy, political elite of the country, has always sown division. He said that's what always happens when the Negro and white masses of the South threaten to unite and build a great society, a society of justice where none would prey upon the weakness of others. We have to have a third Reconstruction in this country. And without a doubt, we are a nation in crisis, but we must be aware, as everyone has said on this call, of the urge to look for scapegoats. Some among the American family want to lay the blame on immigrants and Muslims, and while others would have us believe the responsibility rests solely on the shoulders of one man and the White House. And while that one man has lit some matches, the gasoline has been poured out for a long time. And we must not miss the deeper identity crisis that's being exposed. We must not miss that even COVID, like a contrast die, has exposed the fissures of poverty and racial disparity. The truth is the president is not acting alone. And we cannot give in to the myth of the American innocence, as one writer has said. The history of this country is rife with episodes of political violence, far bloodier and more destructive than the one President Trump incited at the Capitol on Wednesday. But we also have another side of our history, those who have stood together and have stood nonviolently and have taken on these issues down through history. Without a doubt, we are a nation in crisis. We are a nation in crisis, but we have to not just make it about one person. We have to not just make it about one person. We have to recognize that this idea of dividing and polarizing the country has a long and intentional history. It has come from corporate suites. It has come from pulpits. It has come from political offices. It has come even from people who dislike the way Trump lit the fire because they didn't plan to light it. They just poured the gasoline. But now that it's all out in the open, we as people of faith are saying, let's face it and fix it. Let's face it and fix it. And we cannot fix it. We cannot heal this nation without facing the 5 interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty affecting over 140 million people before COVID, the ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that has too often sided with the polarization and the division rather than prophetically standing against it and calling us to a better place. Members of the media, we would take questions at this time if you have them.
All right. We have our first question from Sasha Ambransky. Forgive me if I mispronounced that, from The Nation magazine. He would like to know, when a policy is proposed federally, the OMB analyzes it to explore the fiscal impact. Should Biden's team create a parallel agency, say the Office of Equity and Moral Justice, to explore the equity impact and moral impact of any policy before it is enacted?
One of the things we have said in our presentation of the moral agenda, first 50 and 100 days that grows out of the moral jubilee agenda, is that every policy needs to be disaggregated to show its impact on Black communities, white communities, brown communities, Native communities, women, the disabled, people in Appalachia, people in Alabama. We need the truth in this moment. Too often what happens is when policies are proposed, that we don't put a face on those policies. We don't show how not enacting these policies, as what Joseph Stiglitz has said. We too often don't show the cost of the inequality, not what it's costing to fix it, but what it's costing to leave it the same. Like, we're losing $1 trillion because of child poverty. We're losing trillions of dollars because we're not giving people a living wage, and it's hurting us. So we've said to the administration, every time you roll out a policy, do the disaggregation, however that comes, do a disaggregation of not just what the policy will cost, but what it costs not to implement it. And then do a disaggregation to show. For instance, when there are those, and already he rolled out a policy about changing the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, which is basically what was called for at the March on Washington, because the March on Washington, they wanted $2 an hour in '63, which would be $15 an hour today. What we're saying is we saw people who are already saying that's radical, that's extreme, using the same language that was used to fuel this violence. Nikki Haley just yesterday came out, this is radical. Well, what we're saying to the administration is take it on. And the way you take that on is you say, if this is passed, there are 62 million people in America that would benefit. That's how many people make less than a living wage. There are 39 million families that would be lifted. And here's how many white families, and here's how many black families, and here's how many people in the South where 1/3 of all poor people live. And here's how many people in the Midwest, and here's how many people in the North. Put a face on these policy proposals and show the nation that moral policy is also good economic policy, and it is the only way to lift the nation.
Okay, and our next question is from Amy V. Simmons from the Philadelphia Sunday Sun. Many of the action items listed in the 14 policy priorities to heal the nation and moral and economic agenda for the first 100 days are similar to those that the Biden-Harris administration has outlined for the first 100 days as well. Which of the PPC priorities are not a part of the new administration's plan? Are most urgent in your estimation?
I'm gonna let Liz take some of this, but I would say, first of all, we've not seen all the plans. We're on the front end. So we can't say exactly what's not and what is totally. What we can say in the first COVID plan that he rolled out the other day, things like infrastructure, minimum wage, sick leave, expanded sick leave, expanded unemployment, the raising of the minimum wage, COVID, making sure that COVID relief is more comprehensive, are certainly in theory along the lines of the Poor People's Campaign agenda. We are now evaluating with our economists and with our public health specialists, which we will do with every policy, every piece of it, but we're on the front end. Liz?
Thank you so much, Reverend Barber. And indeed, what we also specifically have noticed from at least the COVID-19 policies is that there's nothing like a national moratorium on water shutoffs, there's not nearly enough resources around housing and homelessness. And those resources seem to be about expanding shelter systems rather than putting people in homes. There's nothing on immigration, although we are waiting to hear about some just immigration reform policies from this administration. And connected to even the question that came right before this, what we know that's missing, both from this COVID priorities and from many of the policies that we passed, is collecting and monitoring indicators, disaggregating the impact. They have not been collecting anything to do with people that are in poverty by income, including also further monitoring and collecting of information about race and age and disability as it impacts COVID, but indeed, we can't engage in moral policy when we don't know how it's impacting people. But there's still much to be done, and we welcome and appreciate some of the bold visionary policies that are being put out.
Okay, we have two more questions. One from, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, part of also the answer to that question is, just like Dr. King said, you have to address poverty, racism, militarism together. What our campaign is saying, it's not as though we say there are 5 interlocking injustices and we could just need to deal with one of them now. They have to be addressed together because they're all interlocking. For instance, we spend 54 cents of every discretionary dollar in the war economy right now, most of it going for defense contractors. Less than 16 cents of every discretionary dollar goes to infrastructure, education, healthcare, and wages. We cannot come out of this pandemic. The Economic Policy Institute has suggested that it may cost us ultimately at the end of all this $16 trillion. We had many people that were already hurting before the pandemic. Let us know that we had 700 people dying a day from poverty before we had 2,000 and 3,000 people dying a day from COVID. We had 89 million people without health care before COVID, and people lost their jobs and lost their health care. So we have to understand we came into this with a context in which many people were already in a form of depression and and a point of deep pain and deep hurt. We cannot ignore that. So it's not just going back to where we were before COVID. It is in fact correcting where we were before COVID, because if we had done some things before COVID, people would have been able to more able to survive COVID. And so we resist when folks say, well, what one or two things do you want? The reality is those who stormed the Capitol the other day, those who've been arguing and fighting for retrogression, they keep talking about they want to take back the country. They mean all of it, every aspect. On the positive side and on the healing side, we must address all 5 of the interlocking justices. It's what Dr. King's wisdom was saying. They're all interconnected. And if we do that, then the whole society lives. And the main thing we've said to the Biden administration, and we'll be meeting with them after the inauguration, is that this is a moment where the moment must drive the movement and must change our imagination. And we must lift from the bottom, lift from the bottom. That's one of the reasons why Liz and I in this campaign came out early, when there were people trying to blame what happened at the Capitol on poor folk. Those are not poor and low-wealth people. We have data that clearly says poor and low-wealth people voted 55% in this past election for a new administration. 55% of poor and low-wealth people. 6 million more came into the electorate because they want change, and they heard at least a little bit. They heard the talk about living wages and healthcare and dealing with systemic racism. And poor and low-wealth people of every race, creed, color, and sexuality have said to us all around this country that what they want is not normalcy. What they want is fundamental reconstruction and transformation. And guess what? If we do it for poor and low-wealth people, the whole nation, the entire world is made better. Last two.
It's actually just one now. Let's see here. We have a question from Angela Tuck from the Southern Poverty Law Center. How can large corporations like Amazon and Walmart, in addition to raising their minimum wages, help improve the nation's economic disparities?
Well, one of the things that those great corporations, can do, and I'm going to ask my dear friend, UCC brother as well, if he wants to take a shot and at some of this. But one of the things that corporations can do is not only raising minimum wage. Corporations can support universal health care for everyone. Corporations can invest and build in poor and low wealth communities. Corporations can pull back their resources from extremist support. You know, we have to admit that a lot of corporations have been supporting people who've been spewing this gasoline of division. They've been supporting networks. They've been supporting candidates. We saw a whole lot of corporations suddenly pull back from Trump after what happened on Wednesday, but in a real sense, should have pulled back long before then. We have persons that work with the Poor People's Campaign, corporate leaders who are starting to recognize that, you know, addressing these interlocking injustices will not be bad for the economy, will not be bad for corporations, but actually will be good. That will be good for the uplifting of the entire nation. And so corporations, Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, when he was trying to raise the minimum wage, and many corporate leaders decided to stand against him, decided to even fund a false religiosity that argued that things like minimum wage and healthcare were quote unquote socialism. Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, any corporation that does not want to pay its people a basic minimum and living wage does not deserve to exist in the nation. He was very frank about that. Corporations should use their corporate power on the side of justice, on the side of righteousness, on the side of uplifting everybody. and then Dr. John, and then Liz can close it.
Thank you. Just a few things. The corporations bear a tremendous responsibility because of the number of people that they employ, but they also, in recent years, have not held their own in terms of paying their fair share of taxes. And corporations are more interested, rather than paying their employees a living wage and investing in the community, than they are in paying lobbyists to pass laws that deregulate their power, and also prevent them from bearing their responsibility, the load of responsibility that they owe to the society in the taxes that they're supposed to pay. And the disproportionate load then put on the not only citizens, but citizens of low income to make up the loss of corporate taxes is extraordinary. A second thing that I think corporations need to pay attention to, the fact that now a Supreme Court decision identifies corporations as people and allows them to participate in our election system in ways that take that power away from the citizens is also something that we think that America should take a much closer look at. I just think corporations wield so much power, but are using that power to build their wealth rather than to distribute a safety net across the landscape of the American public, and have become in some ways responsible for the immense poverty that we're doing everything we can to fight against.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc. Liz?
Yeah, so thanks so much. I mean, so much has already been said, and I really appreciate those answers. I would just want to point out that some of the richest in our society have been able to profit off of this pandemic, and that's because of policy, that's because of economic practices, and that's because, you know, rather than doing what Reverend Dr. Barber said, many of our corporations are using their power for exploitation and for inequality, and not for good. And so, you know, I think in addition to raising wages, allowing and encouraging workers to organize and form and join very, very strong unions, in addition to raising wages, stop lobbying against the expansion of healthcare, stop lobbying against paid sick leave and other protections, and advocating for a fair taxation system, right? A fair taxation when those that can pay the most, including these corporations, you know, what the money that the richest billionaires in the world have made over this pandemic is $1 trillion. That is profiting off of people you know, suffering, and instead what could happen if we had a fair taxation system is that people could enjoy the fruit of their labor and could in fact live full and whole lives, and that indeed, as Dr. Barber said, when we lift from the bottom, everybody rises, including these companies, including these business leaders. And so I really appreciate the question and all of the thoughtful questions.
And as we close out to that, finally, corporations must own the direct line between the politicians that run saying that they're going to cut taxes, they're going to block living wages, and the kind of divisive, scapegoating, racialized class tropes that fuel division. I mean, we cannot ignore that. We cannot ignore that. Many of the candidates, many times they are Republican candidates. This is not partisan, this is just political fact. The ones, for instance, in Georgia recently that were talking about socialism and radicalism and that heard Trump say all of his things were the very elite candidates coming out of the corporate world who were running and basically saying, elect me and I'll block the expansion of healthcare and living wages and expand tax cuts. corporations must disassociate themselves with that and instead associate themselves with, if they don't want to be partisan, they at least ought to join us in being prophetic and standing on the side of justice and lifting everybody, and especially the people who help make their wealth, because their wealth cannot be made without the people, and it should not be simply extracted from the people. It should not be extracted from the people. And they certainly should not be supporting those who will continue to spew and pour this gasoline, because we know through history, not just from 2 weeks ago, we know through history, if you pour this gasoline of lies and white supremacy and class division, eventually somebody will come along and light the match. And it'll either burn a church, or it'll assassinate a leader like Dr. King, or it'll burn a synagogue, or it'll march around a mosque. But it will always be lit. We've got to stop not only the gasoline lighters, we've got to stop the continuing contamination of the gasoline itself.
Actually, Reverend Barber, we have a question regarding Oak Flat. Are you available to take it?
We can, if Reverend, and is Reverend, I know Dr. Wensley, he may have had to go. If not, yes.
Okay. This is from Deborah Kroll from, let's see here, from the Arizona Republic. She would like to know, how will faith leaders help support Native American religious beliefs and tribes' rights to practice Native religious beliefs?
Let me just say it succinctly. I'm a Christian, I'm a disciple of Christ, Christian church pastor. I would not stand by if a corporation in collusion with the government tried to tear down the sacred spots of the Christian faith. We have Jewish people here, Rabbi Rick Jacobs. I know that my Jewish brothers and sisters would not stand idly by if a corporation just for profit would try to tear down the sacred religious sites of the Jewish community, whether it be Mount Sinai or other sacred places. We have Muslims on this call, and I know that they would not stand by if they saw corporations and government in collusion to destroy Mecca or to destroy a mosque. There's not one group of faith people that would stand by and not stand against this attempt. What the government under the Trump administration is trying to do with this corporate iteration is to destroy the most holy site of the birth of Apache religion. We as people of faith have to stand against that and stand with them. The Apache people have a right to the practice of their religion. It is first guaranteed by God, and it is also a promise in our Constitution. And it is unconstitutional for the Trump administration to give sacred federal land to a multinational corporation that is known for its disruption and destruction of the environment and community, and to simply steal it away from the Apache Nation, and in some ways do it in the last few days, the final parts of the last few days of administration, as though it's retaliation because Native Americans turned out in this election and voted and did not support the Trump extremism. We as people of faith must stand with them and support the lawsuit that is now going forward based on First Amendment rights and the right to the freedom of religion.
Thank you, Bishop Barber, and thank you, panelists, faith leaders, for being with us today. Thank you, press. As we conclude this conference, If I could also share that at 1 o'clock today, Eastern Time, 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. Pacific Time, we will be convening again an interfaith service of love, light, and leadership. We expect hundreds of thousands, maybe more, to join us. And press and panelists, of course, we welcome you to join us for that service at 1 p.m. Eastern Time today. Thank you all again for being here today.